Good morning, Christ Church. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sunday Forum and Pumpkin Bread Sunday. By the way, if any of you want good sources for pumpkin pies, I'm the person, because I literally will drive 15 minutes to get a good pumpkin pie to and from some store. If you know a good place, let me know. Today is our grand finale in celebrating Notre Dame de Paris, the great cathedral, one of the most sacred buildings on earth. Today we're distinguished to have Professor Barry Bergdoll, who is the Meyer Shapiro Professor of Art History at Columbia University. And he's one of the world's leading authorities on modern and contemporary architecture. From 2007 to 2013, Professor Bergdoll served as the chief curator of architecture and design at the Museum of Modern Art, where he organized groundbreaking exhibitions that reshaped how we think about architecture and design in a global context. Professor Bergdoll's scholarship spans the 18th through the 21st centuries, with a particular focus on France and Germany. But perhaps most importantly, he has been deeply involved with the study and preservation of Notre Dame de Paris, that extraordinary cathedral, which after centuries of challenge continues to rise from the ashes as a symbol of faith, art, and national identity. Today, Professor Bergdoll will take us on a historic journey through Notre Dame's remarkable history, from its medieval origins and its revolutionary desecration to its rebirth as a global icon of resilience and renewal. Please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Bergdoll to Christ Church. We're thrilled to have you here.
Thank you. So, I guess it's still morning. Good morning, everybody. And thank you for coming. I thought I was going to a place I'd never been before, but I discovered that can you hear me? Is this not on? Maybe. It is on. Maybe this needs to be closer to my mouth. How's that? Is that better? Let's hope it stays. No. What? Down? Here. How's that? Good. Okay. I was just saying, and here's proof of the pudding. That, whoops. Even worse. Let's hope this. How's that? It's okay? All right. Anyway, I was surprised to see some familiar faces. Some of them haven't seen for a long time. So thank you all for coming. I want to show you quite a lot of images. First, I'll give an advertisement in case I forget to do so. One of the figures you're going to discover today is a first range of Saving Notre Dame, because we all know the fire, and you'll see it again in dramatic television clip of 2019, but in the 19th century, the cathedral was in danger of collapsing of its own weight and lack of repair and lack of respect, and was restored very substantially by a father figure of modern preservation and restoration theory, Viollet-le-Duc. So here is the advertisement. You are all invited from January 26th on through the spring of 2026 to an exhibition that I have curated together with another specialist of Viollet-le-Duc, which will be presented at the Bard Graduate Center. So mark your calendars sometime after the 26th of January to come to the galleries of the Bard Graduate Center, and you'll see an entire floor there of drawings, of which you'll see a few today, that are related to the 19th century restoration of Notre Dame. So I am not a medievalist, so I am going to go very quickly through the construction of Notre Dame and get it into a situation of modern peril and talk about this. But we could say that there have been three critical centuries for Notre Dame. The first is the just over 100 years of its construction as we see it today. We tend to think of it as something that came into existence as a unified work of art, but it is actually the product of quite a number of changes even over the course of its long construction in the 12th and 13th century. but we're going to focus on these two later periods, 1842 to, that should say 1865, sorry, we're missing a digit there, the 20 years of its 19th century restoration, which are in a certain sense as substantial a part of its building fabric, of its stones and its glass, and its decor as the Middle Ages. So I'm a historian of the 19th century, and I like to say provocatively it's one of the great buildings of the 19th century. And then, of course, we almost lost it on April 15th, 2019, and it has rather miraculously, in only 5 years, been not only saved, but brilliantly restored. Just to have a sense, how many people here have seen it since it reopened? Quite a number of you. So when we get to the tour of my iPhone slides, they'll be very familiar to you. I should say that the Notre Dame as a church, as a sanctuary, goes back to early Christian times. We know that there were a host of earlier sanctuaries on this site, the Île de la Cité, one of the islands in the Seine that was already occupied in Roman times. We know of religious sanctuaries as early as the 4th century, and indeed there were some significant discoveries made archaeologically about the prior history of the site during the recent restoration. What you're essentially looking at is a 12th and 13th century building, although there are many details, large and small, which are of the 19th century. I wonder how many, I don't know if this is going to point, no, I'm going to point literally myself, how many people realize that here you're looking at the sacristy. It's completely an invention of the 19th century. It's going to play a role in our story, so brilliantly disguised as though it had been created in the Middle Ages that very few people realize that they're not looking at a 19th century building. Why is there so much attention now of Notre Dame? It has a lot really to do with the tragic events, so I thought I'd put us in the mood of a building that stands there as a symbol of Christian permanence, but in fact was periled in a very specific moment. So.
It was 1 month ago this week, the flames leaping of Notre Dame Cathedral. The spire engulfed, and at the moment, it came down. The spire collapsed along with the hearts of the people of Paris and the world. The pictures are still haunting. So many were praying, asking, would any of the cathedral be saved? The images of the firefighters racing to save the relics are still haunting.
It was, in fact, saved minutes before the North Tower might, in fact, have collapsed, bringing down the whole west front. So let's just quickly, don't worry, we're not going to spend an hour on this. There's no exam either at the end. There's just cake and coffee. But this is a diagram from a wonderful book that has now come out in an English edition that takes you through the centuries of Notre Dame's history and explains its complex history. As you can see, this shows the various phases of construction for about 150 years. It shows what's very typical in medieval cathedral construction, moving from the east to the west. What frequently happens in these long-scale construction sites is that by the time the west front is finished, the east end, the altar end, the most sacred end of the cathedral, is thought to be out of date. And sometimes they start again then updating. So there's this constant search for a kind of unity in style, rather remarkably unified at Notre Dame, if we pay attention. But when we pay attention to these different colors, they do also point out to us a number of key things, which is one, that there was an outer ring of chapels that was added towards the end of the period, 1290 to 1330, and this leads to these flying buttresses that are taking, of course, the weight of the vaults all the way over those new chapels out to the outer wall buttresses. And we can also see that relatively late on, there was a reworking of the east, of the north and the south transept ends, which is why they are much later in sculptural detail and architectural detail. So enough of me pretending to be a historian in the Middle Ages, but I wanted also to set this up for us because it raises the question, when you see this diagram of all of the different moments of construction over nearly 150 years, if you're going to restore a building, to what period do you restore it? To what moment of its history is the appropriate one? And this is going to become a very big question in the 19th century. And key for us as a little bit of background, Here, if we were having a pop quiz, I would be asking you, what is the difference from the photograph that you see on the right? Of course, we're looking at a rather elevated position. This is a pre-fire photograph towards the apse, towards the high altar. From the west toward the east, we're standing up in a tribune in the west front. Between that and this elevation, this architectural drawing that records the elevation of the tripartite system of construction. I'm not going to wait for you all to scream out that, of course, you noticed that you don't see these here. There had been some substantial change between the early medieval construction and the suppression of these small rose windows in each of the bays of the nave in favor of what introduced not only much more light, but much larger field for these fantastic stained glass windows into the cathedral. And this is still to this day debated among medievalists and among restoration architects exactly what happened. It's going to be absolutely key for understanding the 19th century intervention with the question, to what moment do you restore the cathedral? Many medievalists insist that this was the result of a fire. So we know there had been earlier fires at Notre Dame that led to this change. Philippe Villeneuve, who you'll meet in a little while, not personally, but in photographs, who is the architecte en chef today, and he was responsible for the 5-year campaign of restoring the cathedral since 2019. Philippe insists that he found absolutely no evidence. He said, I would have seen charred stone in places that we had access to. Because of this repair, I don't believe the story of the fire. I think it was a stylistic change. Stylistic change. Of course, anyone who's studied art history knows what's the definition of the Renaissance, the rebirth of the classical, and the beginning of a denigration of Gothic architecture. Needless to say, when Notre Dame de Cathedral was under construction, people didn't say, we're building an amazing Gothic cathedral. Nobody used the term Gothic. This is a later term of abuse, referring to the Goths, those who sacked Rome. They said they were building a modern building. In the 12th, 13th century, Gothic architecture was modern architecture. But we could say by later periods, the style of the cathedral, particularly as kings of France began to associate it more and more, not only with the presence of Christianity materially on earth and the place for the Bishop of Paris and Sens. Actually, Paris is a rather complex history as a diocese, but also as a place of royal power. They were, think of Louis XIV, Versailles, you don't think of a Gothic palace, increasingly somewhat embarrassed by this Gothic style. Louis XIII and Louis XIV, his son, undertook a great deal of work here. But of course, this is the period when Gothic is considered barbarian. But as I'm invoking, it's also the period when politically the monarchy associates itself more and more strongly with veneration of the Virgin Mary, Notre Dame. In 1638, in the midst of the war with Spain, Louis XIII, in hopes for an heir, places his kingdom under the protection of the Virgin, bringing huge attention and works and, of course, royal money to Notre Dame. And this involved a major reworking, we'll see in a moment, of the East End, when Louis XIV renewed his vow in 1650, leading to even more work. So I think one thing that you can see that's very striking here, these are called the paintings that are called the Maze. Every year the guilds of Paris would offer one work of painting to the cathedral. They're now in the museum, they're not displayed there. They were not only a kind of votive offering to the church, but more importantly, they were placed so as to cover much of the Gothic architecture and to begin to regularize the building and hide this somewhat embarrassment of the medieval architecture. And likewise, if we see the removal of this rood screen, which separated, of course, the altar in the east end from the laity in the nave, this is going to be removed. There had been a series of earlier ones. One thing, if you go today to the Musée de Cluny, which is the National Museum of Medieval Art, you will see the colored figures, including the head of Christ, which were found after the fire in the work in this part of the cathedral. But this is going to go away under the late Louis, the late Bourbon monarchy, to be replaced. This is, of course, a simulated image, but they're a photograph. This is an attempt to get back to the Middle Ages. This is, in fact, what under Louis XIV, by the time of Louis XIV, this is Louis XIV praying, offering his crown to the Pietà, to the Virgin, with this reworking of the East End. Miraculously, that sculpture was undamaged by the fire in 2019. Rather poignantly, the only damage it suffered was a bit of lead that fell on the hand of Jesus Christ, which has been left there as memory of the fire. This is not so much to, I don't have images. We're not going to desecrate the cathedral visually by showing you its status under the French Revolution. Of course, infamously, the French Revolution abolished the church. The Cathedral of Notre Dame was used for storing various things, hay and other things, for a time in the 1790s. It was then reworked in its interior, largely with very temporary materials, to be a temple of reason, which was a new secular religion invented, very short-lived, by the Revolution. Possibly its lack of popularity had to do also with the revolutionary calendar, which turned the week from 7 days into 10 days. Most people didn't want to wait an additional 3 days for a day of rest, so reason had, in a certain sense, outsmarted itself. But I'm showing you here not only the reestablishment of the church, a real power play with Napoleon crowning himself, even though he has invited the church hierarchy to his sacre, his sort of imperial consecration. But I'm showing you this painting from the Louvre. It was not stolen, it's still there, because you can see that by this period, the Gothic piers have been wrapped in fake wooden classical columns to begin to classicize as much as possible. So this ongoing disguising of the Gothic heritage. Attitudes are going to change radically after the Revolution. Of course, churches are given back in the opening years of the 19th century to the church hierarchy, which is reestablished. So it's a huge period of restoration, not only of religion, but of monarchical rule. But also, almost at the same time, the rise of Romanticism, first in literature, which is going to appreciate Gothic as having a spiritual capacity to move, both to move in spiritual Christian terms, but also to move in powerful artistic terms. The first is probably in 1802 with the publication by Chateaubriand of Le Génie du Christianisme, the genius or the spirit of Christianity, in which gives rise to a new appreciation of Gothic, not only as the most spiritual form of architecture he proclaims. This is one great school of thought. There are others who say, no, classical architecture, early Christian is pre. Big controversies in the 19th century, what would constitute a Christian architecture, but even more importantly, what would constitute a national architecture and a national expression. Huge battles over whether Gothic was born in France, Germany, or England. Ultimately, historians will come by the middle of the 19th century to agree that the Gothic style was born in France and indeed in the Ile-de-France, and therefore the claims of the French crown with an association with it are absolutely justified. But I'm showing you here two images, one French on the left. This is from Villaduc. You're all going to go away from this lecture saying we need to celebrate Villaduc. We're headed to the Bard Graduate Center in January. This is Villaduc imagining the perfect Gothic cathedral. It's actually not an illustration of any cathedral that exists. He took the best parts from various cathedrals around the Ile-de-France and composed his idea of the perfect Gothic cathedral. On the right is a painting by the German artist Vincent Staats, which is called Fertig wird das Dach, it will be finished, pointing to an imagination of how Cologne Cathedral could be completed. Interestingly, these great cathedral work sites of the 19th century and these restoration projects are also going to give rise to a whole school of architects in various countries who become proficient again in building Gothic. So we are standing in a kind of late result of that, your early 20th century neo-Gothic church. But many of the figures who would build new Gothic churches in the 19th century throughout Europe, and then, strangely enough, in America, where there was no Gothic past, were trained on these work sites. Perhaps the most impressive, and in some ways the most metaphorically poetic, is Cologne Cathedral. Cologne Cathedral stood in a state of incompletion long enough from the Middle Ages that the new art of photography, invented in 1839, could capture it. So here we have an early photograph of Cologne right before it's decided in 1842 that the building needs to be completed. This is a 14th century crane that was still in place where the towers had not been built. Now, of course, Cologne was in what was after the Napoleonic Wars, the Prussian Rhineland. There was no unified Germany. And to a certain extent, the idea of completing Cologne Cathedral became a parallel with the idea of creating a unified German state. But most importantly, the Cathedral Building Workshop became the site for training the architects who would go on to restore Vienna and build Neo-Gothic buildings throughout Central Europe. But our story is in France, and here, again, literary origins, picking up on Chateaubriand and others who, at the turn of the century, had begun to celebrate Gothic as the ultimate Christian expression, but also the ultimate French expression. Much of this really comes to the fore. Nobody was going to pick up Génie du Christianisme and say this is the best bedtime read ever, but the dramatic story of Notre-Dame de Paris, in my mind, the first novel that ever took a building rather than a person as its main character, of Victor Hugo, begins publication in 1830-31, and in which he cries out against the state of disrepair of Notre Dame. True, it had been returned to the church, but very little work had been done to repair it, to consolidate it. And in that same year, Victor Hugo also published a stirring pamphlet called Guerre aux démolisseurs, or War Against Those Who Demolish. So making architecture, as he said, into the great book of history. And let's just look at what Notre Dame looked like at that moment, if this will go forward. It's a little bit pixelated, but here is a drawing that records the medieval spire. You can see by this engraving, partially etching, of about the time of Victor Hugo's novel, that the cathedral is not only in a poor state, this poor image will reinforce my point, but the spire is gone, and if we could zoom in on it, we would see stones falling off the building actually very dirty from the beginning of industrial pollution in Paris, but even worse, the building which had been sacked in the 1830 revolution, and again in an 1831 uprising, popular uprising, which took symbols of church and state as signs of oppression. So here we see the sack in 1831 of the sacristy. So that's the same sacristy that you saw a minute ago that I told you is not Middle Ages. These are some drawings that survive for what had been an 18th century neoclassical rebuilding of the sacristy. This is through the figure, very important architect, of Jacques Germain Soufflot. We'll see his major creation in just a moment appearing on the skyline. But he had been, in the 1760s, so this would be under Louis XV, the architect of Notre Dame. Notre Dame, like most French monuments, always had an architect appointed to it who would do whatever was necessary. Soufflot was no fan of the physical appearance of Gothic, although, like many of his time, he admired the structural prowess of Gothic architecture, but he thought that it had no underlying aesthetic harmony or rule. I'm contrasting here a drawing engraved later from the very early 18th century, pre-Soufflot, with this, the oldest known daguerreotype that we know of the cathedral. Daguerreotypes are going to play a very key role in the restoration of the building. So interestingly, the modern science of monument restoration and photography are new inventions, we might say, of the 1830s and 1840s. Indeed, it is in 1834 that the French set up the State Commission on Historic Monuments and begin to say that there are buildings that need to be protected by the state as for their historic use. Complex relationship between the church that uses the building and the state that owns the building after the revolution. But what I'm wanting you, giving you a lot of background there so that you have already observed for yourself that there have been some very significant changes between the early 18th century and the state of the building in 1841. Obviously, this famous row of kings is gone. This was partly because they were in bad repair, and then additionally because the revolutionaries thought they were portraits of the kings of France. They didn't realize that they were the descent of David as the kings of Judea and of the Bible. Also, Louis XV wanted great processions to come into the building, so this central figure of Christ's blessing on the trumeau, or the jamb between the doors, had been removed. There's been various, first you don't notice them, but they're actually very, very significant changes. Here are two protagonists for the first saving of the building. They're going to enter a competition. We'll see their drawing in a moment, and you can come see the originals in the exhibition that I keep advertising. You can see these are people who are so into Gothic that they walked around with it instead of a satchel of books that I might have or some other kind of thing, walking around with ideas of a perfect cathedral. The older architect Lassus here and his younger associate, although depicted many years later in a caricature carrying a cathedral with a very high spire, Eugène Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc. And they enter the competition in 1843. I'm quoting later a report that they write about it, and they say that their aim is to re-establish the cathedral to its ancient splendor. So this idea of restoration as being a taking something back to what Viollet-le-Duc says is its moment of perfect aesthetic glory. This is the drawing. It's about just a little bit bigger than what you see projected here, set of 4 that they send in to propose what they're going to do. Clearly, they're going to reestablish the kings. They're going to repair and recreate the jumeaux. They're going to add a lot of floral ornament that has disappeared over time. And we'll see in 2, they're going to add the famous gargoyles. Everybody buys a postcard of the gargoyle of Notre Dame and sends it to their friends to say, we love the Middle Ages. They're entirely a creation of the 19th century. And they're going to restore the spire that had been taken down for disrepair even before the Revolution. You'll sometimes read that it was taken down by the revolutionaries. This is absolutely not true. We're going to go this way. This is one of my favorite photographs of Paris under transformation in the Second Empire by the famous Baron Haussmann, the Haussmannization of Paris under Napoleon III. It's a moment when construction has begun for what is today the Central Hospital of Paris, the Hôtel Dieu, which will soon also include a permanent museum of Notre Dame. So we must be about 1860. What is wonderful about it is it gives us a rare open view of the cathedral from the north, and it also shows us this contrast with the dome of what is today the Pantheon, but was built as the Church of Sainte-Geneviève by the architect Soufflot. So the same Soufflot who builds this image of the classical dome as the presence of Sainte-Geneviève, but also of the Christian church on the skyline of Paris, is the one who's going to try to de-Gothicize this. And now our aim is how to return it in Viollet-le-Duc's eyes to its medieval glory. And this for him will not be limited to simply restoring the building. All of the surroundings are to be affected in relationship to these great urban planning endeavors that are underway in the middle of the 19th century, Second Empire, 1850s and 1860s. This is a period when the population of the Ile de la Cité will go from something like 20,000 down to 2,000. So we have an incredible depopulation of the historic core of the city. Almost all of these buildings are going to disappear within a few years, doing a number of things. One, creating an institutional landscape of hospital, court system, police, and cathedral, and in Viollet-le-Duc's hope, also a great bishop's palace, which was never built here, and a kind of park-like setting to open up the cathedral with a frame of open space that it could be appreciated not only as a great religious building, but as a great work of French national architectural creation. So those are some of the projects. As I say, this is one of the first great undertakings of the 19th century for which we have early photographic documentation. This is an 1847 salt print, not a daguerreotype, by the great photographer Bayard, showing the work is already underway. And you can see here the sacristy is under construction. Work has begun on consolidating the North Tower, and if you pay attention to those buttresses, they're going to change very radically in form, because Viaduc is going to rebuild almost every single one of them. And here we have it happening. In the exhibition, you're going to see not only the beautiful drawings of the building as it should look, but you're going to see things like this, which are called the attachments. These are drawings signed by everyone involved that are a survey of all of the stones in each of these buttresses. This is on the south side, moving towards the apse. You can see they're starting to go like this, but you can see the state of the stones in the 19th century. So this is a recording of which stones need to be replaced, what quarry to get them from, and what Viaduc loves about the medieval buttress is, for him, it is the summary of the constructional genius of the Gothic architect, because they calculate the structural forces that are needed, and they put more material where you need buttressing, compression, and solidity, and when you can narrow, you narrow to the absolute minimum required. And for him, this is really the genius of Gothic architecture, that every thing you see is of a constructional necessity, and all he thinks he's doing is consolidating that great spirit of the Christian Middle Ages. Now, when he gets inside is where we begin to have things that might strike us as controversial. Few would contest that you've got to repair stone like that and make a wise decision, pick the right type of stone and the like. But what about the interior? So here's the second question on your quiz. What has changed between this image from the just before Viaduc during for one thing, you'll see there's not any furniture in an early 19th century church service, and this photograph, which is an early 20th century photograph, looking at the crossing, obviously north transept, east end, and you can see what Viaduc has done is that he has recreated in a series of bays right there, he has recreated the earlier four-partite nave elevation and then kept the three-part there. So we have a very interesting thing with Viaduc. He's, on one hand, he's interested in the unity of style, and on the other hand, he has introduced into it something of the history of the building itself. He almost as though he wants the Notre Dame not only to speak as a unified work of art, but to tell its story as a building that had grown and changed with the evolution of even the relationship of church to state, but of the search for a perfected Gothic style. Viaduc believed very adamantly that the plain stone appearance of the cathedral came about from the loss of its brilliant polychromatic, multicolored decoration, that the cathedrals, in fact, particularly in the side chapels, were painted up, that often, oops, doesn't like me to speak about him, so he always tries to stop my lectures. The habit to hang buildings with fabrics, particularly in cold periods, but also on high feast days, on celebrations, he thinks was commemorated ultimately by painting a permanent system of fabrics. The colored windows, some of which had been lost to disrepair and to revolutionary vandalism, all of this he thought needed to be restored. So he wanted to create the image of the cathedral as a total work of art. We'll come back to that in a moment. Most of those survived until the 1960s, which began a kind of purification, anti-Viaduc restoration, which could have been a third moment that I could have introduced into this, but we're celebrating the recreation of the Middle Ages, not the undoing of Viaduc. But look at the, I'm going to give you a few before and after photographs for you to train your eye. You can see the Viaduc decides that the buttresses had moved in historical time, and he makes them much more sophisticated and much more elaborate in their detail. When you're there next time, you are not looking at medieval buttresses there. You are looking at the replacement of these medieval ones from the early photograph. And there are a whole series of these. I'm not going to take you every detail. At first glance, you might say nothing much has changed here between early 1840s and after Viaduc's work, probably a photograph of about 1870. But if you pay careful attention, you will see that he has actually rebuilt the entire rose window and twisted it because he thought it was illogical that there was a gap at the top rather than a bit of the tracery. So this whole building, this whole window was in a certain sense like a watch face that was twisted a few degrees to align. And you can also see that he begins to add many more crockets to create a much more agitated, decorative profile for the entire building. And it's right in the midst of this work that Viollet-le-Duc pens what is often thought to be one of the most provocative, and indeed provocatively influential, statements when he introduces into his dictionary, his complete dictionary of French architecture from the 11th to the 16th century, in 10 volumes, which becomes a kind of manual for learning again Gothic, but it also exposes his belief that Gothic architecture was not only a complete work of art, but that everything was interrelated towards a purpose. So no matter where you enter into the dictionary, you're ultimately sent back to the article on cathedral. But in the 8th volume, he introduces the word restoration, singular, feminine. Le mot et les choses sont modernes. Both the word and the thing are modern. This is actually, so he's telling you immediately, even the idea of the restoration, he says, comes from our period, our 19th century period. It is characteristic of our 19th century period, this cultivated historical consciousness. But the real zinger comes next. To restore an edifice means neither to maintain it, nor to repair it, nor to rebuild it. It means to reestablish it in a finished state, which may in fact never have actually existed at any given time. So this idea of a historical perfection that's more perfect than something that might have happened. We're going to get that ideal cathedral even if there is no moment in time when it actually existed. And so the cathedral is going to, in a certain sense, become more Gothic than Gothic. He believed that there was not only spiritual information, but a great deal of almost popular information, a whole view of the world on the medieval cathedral. He knew that there had been what are called chimeras and also gargoyles, a fantastic kind of bestiary that populated the heights of the cathedral. There are lots of theories about what they meant. Were they images of evil in relationship to the triumph of good? What is the actual meaning of all of this secular, worldly image on the cathedral? They had existed, and they were known to have been removed already before the Revolution because they were falling down. They were falling on people's heads. They were crumbling. And he decided to recreate them all. Absolutely no visual evidence of what they looked like. These are entirely out of the imaginary of Viollet-le-Duc. Here are the drawings for them. There are scores of these drawings, and here they are dialoguing with the changing face of the city of Paris. Perhaps his most important contribution, and one that became incredibly controversial after the April 15th, 2019 fire, is the issue of the spire. So as you can see here, we can date this because this sacristy is now done. So we're in about 1850 in this photograph. Work is ongoing. There's one of the construction work sites. The Orphans Hospital has not yet been torn down. So we can read from what we know of historical information, actually date that photograph perfectly. This is a painting dated 1752 in the wonderful Museum of the City of Paris, Carnavalet. And we can see not only all the houses that are going to be demolished on the Ile de la Cité as it becomes an institutional landscape, and as we free up space around Notre Dame to be appreciated as a work of architectural art, but there we have evidence of what the late medieval spire was. Much shorter than what Viollet-le-Duc ultimately will build. So here is the competition drawing of 1842-43 in which Lassus and Viollet-le-Duc had imagined something about on the scale of that. Whether they knew this painting or not, I don't know. But 1857, Lassus dies. Viollet-le-Duc has been at work on this cathedral now for the better part of 15 years, and many others as well. Amiens, Reims, didn't do too much at Chartres, but he becomes really, in a certain sense, he is reinventing the Middle Ages for modernity. And now he feels very confident. He says, I can speak Gothic better than anybody else alive on the planet today. I can even imagine what would have been the best spire they could have imagined had they imagined it. And so he builds something nearly twice the height of what we know had been there in the Middle Ages. partly, I think, in order to tower over every classical building in Paris and make Notre Dame again the absolutely not only the center of Paris, but the center of France. Many of you might know that all distances in France are measured from the South Tower of Notre Dame. So if you're on the highway, you'll suddenly see a big sign, and it'll say, "You are at 100 kilometers from Notre Dame." So if you're late for Mass, you know. You can judge. And okay, so here's his spire, and probably his greatest original contribution to the cathedral, along with his idea that stepping up the ridgeline of the roof would be the apostles. And so there they are in these incredible bronze sculptures by the sculptor Geoffroy de Saint-Hilaire. And oops, the spire's going to fall down, and my thing too. We see them. And here is, as you can see, they're all looking down. They're all carrying books and symbols so that we can identify the individual one. This is St. Thomas. I happen to know what he looks like. That is the face of Viollet-le-Duc. So Viollet-le-Duc depicts himself as St. Thomas, a little bit hubristic, of course, but St. Thomas was the patron saint of builders and of architects. And Viollet-le-Duc is turning around and looking up and admiring his greatest contribution, the spire itself. These were taken down in early April 2019 to go for restoration. They were beginning to show the signs of pollution on these 19th century statues, so they were off-site on April 15th when the fire broke out, and when, as you saw in the ABC News broadcast, the spire, the flesh, fell through the roof, damaging, taking out the central crossing, the nave and the transept, and taking out about a third of the first vault just to the west of the crossing of the transept in the nave. So there's a photograph of a couple of days afterwards. What to do after a fire? Quickly, cathedral fires are not infrequent, particularly when buildings are under restoration, as this one was already. And we know historically that often a decision is made to build things in a much more contemporary technology, even if the original medieval form is kept. So here, the Great Fire at Chartres in June 1836. You can see it after the timber roof is gone, just exposing the upper side of the stone vaults. So as you all, I'm sure, realize, the roof of a cathedral and the vaults under it are not the same thing. There's a timber roof built over the vaults to protect them. So here's a watercolor showing us the exposing of those vaults. And the decision was made, and here inside of Chartres Cathedral, one of the earliest masterworks, even before the great train sheds of the 19th century, to rebuild the roof of Chartres Cathedral in iron. So this could have been a decision for Notre Dame, a huge controversy in April and May of 2019. Reims Cathedral, very substantially damaged in both world wars, rebuilt in iron and concrete with money from the Rockefellers after the First World War. But what about Notre Dame? Huge controversy. Modern roof, since miraculously the building was saved from total collapse because if the west front had begun to crumble, the whole building would have gone down. So this was miraculous that it stopped at this level. And the decision was made to rebuild in a medieval technique, completely replacing the great timber work, which was happily had been recorded in detail, partly by a former Columbia student who had essentially x-rayed and used computer technology to have a perfect document of what was called the forest, the timber that's completely disappeared now, and to rebuild. So this is supposed to have an effect. This is before and after. These are photographs actually that I took. This is a photograph from about a year after the fire, and this is a photograph from about a year and a half ago. That's the exact same vault. It's almost impossible to see what's been restored. And there we are looking up. Now, you've never seen the cathedral that white unless you've been back in the last 15 months. And the decision made to recreate, using those surveys, all of the damaged timber work. So this is a tour that I took with Philippe Villeneuve in 2023, and we went up on the scaffolding. You can see the state of the vaults there, and then beginning of work some months later, and we're climbing on this incredible scaffolding. The buttresses are being kept from imminent collapse by recentering them the way they would have been built in the first place. So you can hardly see the cathedral for the construction that's involved in recreating the timber roof using no modern material. So woodworkers were brought from around the country, as well as trees that were donated. Relatively green timber was used because it is believed that in the Middle Ages they did not often use cured wood. They calculated in for the transformation in wood that would happen as it aged. Now, immediately after the fire, literally within 72 hours, was the debate over what about the spire that had fallen down. The spire, after all, was 19th century. It was Viollet-le-Duc who was going to be vilified all over again. Now, UNESCO Heritage says that the cathedral, at the time of its designation, its fabric is what is protected. So to actually decide not to recreate the 19th century elements of the building, to make some distinction between medieval and 19th century, flies in the face of modern post-Venice Charter UNESCO doctrine. Nonetheless, President Emmanuel Macron was very eager that Notre Dame bear the mark of the 21st century, that the current historical moment also be recorded, particularly as this valiant effort. He swore he would have the building open in time for the Paris Olympics. Didn't quite make it, but almost. And this unleashed a controversy when he suggested perhaps they would even have a competition for what a 21st century roof and spire might look like. This competition was never opened, but it did not prevent those architects who I call the ambulance chasers from submitting their ideas nonetheless. Some thought it would be, you could have a green roof, which would literally be a botanical garden with a kind of modern flesh, different kinds of notions of what a 21st century roof might look like, making a sign of the 21st century contribution to Notre Dame and to the skyline of Paris. Petitions began to be launched all over the place. I signed one of them in the newspaper Le Figaro. Was called the next day by Le Monde, saying, you're American, why did you sign that petition? And I ended up being interviewed in Le Monde on my views about Viollet-le-Duc, etc. But this is one of these petitions. Let us reconstruct this tower, this spire, not another one. All the more, of course, in that all 12 of the apostles, including the portrait of Viollet-le-Duc, were off being restored in a warehouse. Where were they going to go was one of the things I said in defense of recreating the spire that served in part as a platform for the apostles reigning over the cathedral, but also over the skyline of Paris. Miraculously, a few days after the fire, someone found the famous coq gaulois, the rooster, from the top of the spire. It was a symbol always of the cathedral, the rooster related as it is to it's a French emblem of vigilance, but also sometimes interpreted as a symbol of Christ's resurrection. So the miraculous rediscovery on the sidewalk of the very battered rooster led further to the idea that it should be rebuilt. The rooster was too damaged to be put back in place, and the modern sign is the architect Philippe Villeneuve here in a drawing as a kind of phoenix from the fire, creating a new rooster which was put in place early in 2025. In order to do that, of course, required recreating the spire. This was incredibly complicated because the spire sits over a void, and it's in itself an incredible work of 19th century carpentry engineering. So here we see him fabricating the pieces and figuring out how to put them in place to recreate the complex holding of this spire over the void of the crossing, the crane now putting in the top of the spire, and then the cross, and then above it, of course, the rooster. So Viollet-le-Duc is now about to come back to place. Statues are just being returned. maybe even right now as we're speaking. But Viollet-le-Duc will look up at Philippe Villeneuve's recreation of his great masterwork of 1857 to 65, the neo-Gothic spire of Notre Dame, but he will also look up and see what only if you get up close you can see, the face of Philippe Villeneuve looking down in conversation with Viollet-le-Duc. President Macron was very eager to open the cathedral. Ultimately, it would be opened on the feast day of the Virgin in December of last year. Here we see him poised for the television. He actually took a television tour of it a few days before the reconsecration and the opening, because it would have actually violated both church usage and the French Constitution for him to actually open the building. But he wanted to take credit for this, so he gave a television tour. The day before the opening, Philippe invited me to go through with a few friends. So you're going to see now, I'm going to take you on a tour of the building as it appeared last December, a few days before the opening. Now, we knew that Macron had been there. That's my foot right there. I think that's my foot. And all over the floor, we kept finding the French flag. That's where he was to stand for the television shots. They're now gone. But this is our tour. Here's Philippe. He is an amateur organist himself, so you can see work is still going on. They're working on adjusting the lighting. Some comments on that in a moment. We went up to see, this is all the brand new work, but a recreation in only using metalwork and ironwork and woodwork and wood cutting instruments that were already in use in the Middle Ages to recreate the carpentry. Yeah, there. So there is the return of the forest with modern fire prevention techniques. And this is one of the only new works is that Philippe has created a new way to go from the north to the south tower, but otherwise very few modern interventions into this. So let's take a tour of the building, me right behind Philippe. These are my photographs, not him, but you can see that he was thinking about his work and we were discussing it. It was really a great privilege to be in Notre Dame, one of the rare times when there was hardly anybody present. So one of the other few additions, which you can like or dislike, we could discuss it, is this new baptismal font that greets you right as you come in. Unfortunately, it stands up about that high off the nave floor, so they had to add this so you won't trip on it towards it. But that's one of the few new additions, along with this great gold cross behind the Louis XIV rearrangement of the apse. And so, as you can see, Corbusier once wrote a book in 1942 called When the Cathedrals Were White, because no one could imagine it. Unfortunately, Corbusier died in 1965, so he has not seen ever in his lifetime Notre Dame as the great white building that perhaps it was in the 13th century. You can also see all of the new lighting that has been put into place. I'm also going to show you some discoveries that were made along the way. So there we are looking from also the new high altar with the 17th century choir stalls and the vaults completely cleaned, all the stonework completely cleaned. Some preservationists argue that the building is too smacking new, too white, etc. I suppose discussing this with Philippe, I sort of used the analogy almost if you're going to clean your teeth, you're going to leave them half cleaned. Where do you stop? If you're cleaning something, shouldn't you clean it completely? But this has been one of the controversies on the fact that the building is so sparkling new that it's almost impossible to believe that you're looking essentially, for the most part, at 13th century stonework with some substantial recarving in certain places by Viollet-le-Duc. Of course, these are the lighting people who were working. So I want to tell you something about the lighting. I was a bit shocked by the lighting, and Philippe admitted as well. Apparently there are 36 settings. So these are taken at a few moments apart. They were trying to figure out which lighting was most appropriate. This is a little bit more mellow for me, but you can make your own vote on this. This is somewhat more of the sort of sense of spiritual awe and mystery that I would like to see in a church, but I take huge issue with, and I think Philippe Villeneuve also agrees with me, the decision, he blames the clergy, for this uplighting of the vaults, which I think is a terrible mistake. I think they should sort of go into daylight, whatever the daylight is, but the lighting is all adjusted for this rather operatic uplighting. Okay, new lighting around the apse end, the high altar, and then a tour just around through the side aisles. Here we have the ambulatory, moving through the ambulatory to the newly gilded cross. These are remarkable Viollet-le-Duc creations. They almost look like Art Deco. So here we are coming out of the sacristy. Here, no smoke damage whatsoever. So this is a rather well-preserved 19th century painting. So I want to introduce you to the importance that Viollet-le-Duc placed on the elaborate creation of a total work of art through pattern, through color, through the picking out of the different ribs are painted in different ways. This is a 19th century imagination of what medieval color in the building would have looked like. And included, of course, an enormous amount of subject matter of biblical stories and stories that are meant, therefore, to the idea. We think of John Ruskin writing about the Bible of Amiens, the idea that the cathedral is also an illustrated Bible for those who are not capable to read the Bible, for the illiterate. You can see these have all been cleaned. This is not recreation when you go. This is Viollet-le-Duc's search for abstract floral ornament, and then these extraordinary interplay between works of art from very different periods. But all of this painting is 19th century. In the 1960s, a campaign was begun in many churches to remove 19th century wall decoration. There was a huge distaste for the neo-Gothic, particularly in Gothic buildings. At Notre Dame, they began by taking the painting out of the side chapels of the nave. So today, the side chapels of the nave are unpainted stone, but they had never gotten to the apse, to the east end. So the radiating chapels off the ambulatory were very filthy dirty, but they were all Viollet-le-Duc. When I was a student working on Viollet-le-Duc, I would try to take photographs of them in their filth. Many of them were cleaned right before the fire, but of course re-smoked up and re-sooted during the fire. They have all now been cleaned and restored, and the patterns are absolutely remarkable. This is all 19th century work. I mean, these absolutely extraordinary patterns that Viollet-le-Duc comes up with, his willingness to have them clash as though they ran out of paper when you're buying a book in the shop and they had to do the underside in a different pattern. Here's some of the bestiary of Viollet-le-Duc in one of the side chapels. These absolutely incredibly inventive, abstract. This is not 20th century. This is not Kandinsky or Klee in the 20th century. This is Viollet-le-Duc in the 19th. And then these harmonies that he creates between colored teaching of the colonnettes and of the ribs of the vaults. And as we move out, this is all Viollet-le-Duc. You see this transition from painted to non-painted. And just some sense as we complete our tour, because you'll never see the building with so few people in it. Today, a word to the, you're going to ask, how do I see it if I go? The website opened, the 15,000 people are allowed in every day. The website opens 72 hours in advance. So book or go to Mass. And some of the amazing discoveries, this capital, we were looking at it together and I said, that looks very strange for the 13th century. He said, that's clearly a reuse. We found a few of them, and as we've cleaned, we realized that there are a number of capitals up on the gallery level that are reused from an earlier building. So discoveries continue to be made. If you go, you will say, I thought it was done. Well, the cathedral is in a constant state of repair and restoration, and there's still work on the east end. So I just wanted to regale you with Viollet-le-Duc's imaginary, and we'll just take a tour of the roof level. And Philippe has, again, opened the gallery level. You can go up and have a personal confrontation with the imaginary of Viollet-le-Duc. You can see at this point, this is about not quite a year ago. But the controversy continues, and we'll end with this and maybe take a vote about it if you like. Macron very frustrated that he didn't get his 21st century spire, so he said, we're going to have 21st century stained glass windows. And we are going to remove some of Viollet-le-Duc's windows in which he does not have saints or stories that are just plain, what's called grisaille, plain patterns of windows. And therefore, they're not very important, and we can take those out. And he's commissioned very fine artists, Claire Taboret. My problem is not Claire Taboret. My problem is the desecration of Viollet-le-Duc. And Claire Taboret is creating these new windows to replace these. But what Macron doesn't understand, and what those who are in favor of this don't understand, is that Viollet-le-Duc created a chromatics of the cathedral in relationship to light, which is a progression of color and light that moves towards the high altar. So these are not non-figurative because he ran out of money or ideas or didn't read far enough in the Bible. They are part of his vision of the relationship and the centrality of color and light to the experience of the interior of Notre Dame. And I am not certain that the new windows are not in some ways going to break that. So although some might say that I'm too much of a historian curmudgeon against the new, I said there are places in the cathedral where there is in fact no 19th century glass. Obviously it's not in as prominent a location, but it seems to me that in the 21st century we don't return to an early or mid-20th century view of Viollet-le-Duc's contribution as unworthy, and one doesn't remove it. So this is the current controversy. I think that Macron will prevail now, so if you delay your trip, you will also see the work of Claire Taboret. But I leave you with a question, because the future of the cathedral is always an ongoing work, but I think you can see that there were two moments when dramatically there was an intervention that not only transformed the way we look at the building and what many of its details were, but which kept it from being a total loss. So thank you so much for your attention.
Barry, thank you for a fantastic tour de force. We have maybe time for one or two questions, and if you need to duck out, feel free to do so.
Hi, thank you. This was amazing story. I have two questions. One is, everybody talks about the restoration of the forest, but nobody talks about the restoration of the roof surface itself. I know that the lead plates melting and vaporizing were a tremendous pollution source after the fire, or during the fire. And I was wondering what the new roof surface is.
Lead.
Oh my God. The other is, we happened to be there when the fire started, on the, I guess, the west end of Ile Saint-Louis. And we watched the whole thing, and, well past midnight, it was still burning, and we decided to go to bed. And I fully expected that with the roof gone, that the flying buttresses would push the walls in and the whole thing would collapse. And I'm wondering why that didn't happen.
Yeah, I'm not an engineer, so I guess that I guess that enough of them were intact to keep the dynamic forces at play. I really don't know. I do know that this might be a little bit tangential to your question, but one of the great complications after the fire was getting rid of all that scaffolding that was up there. I don't know what role that might have played in either the structural survival or the structural fragility, but yes, amazingly it held. I think that the big fear of a lot of people was that if the tower fell, that it would go that way, and that it would take the whole building with it. And even if it fell towards the parvis, that the vault structure was tied into that the west front is not just an independent structure. that was tied into the structure of the vault. So that was the real fear when the firemen were there and trying to decide where to fight the fire, because by that point, the fire, and you saw it yourself, by that point the fire had spread the whole length of the roof. Yeah.
It's a double question also, in a way related. Many of the, not only cathedrals, but churches have been built on earlier sacred territory environments. Is there any parallel here that earlier there were other traditions which were spiritual or... and the second question is, I understand right at the entrance, especially some of the sculptures have more than biblical traditional meaning behind it. Do you have any perhaps reference or idea about it? Thank you.
So I think I mentioned very quickly that we know that there were Christian structures on the site. There were a number of small sanctuaries there in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. Whether there was I don't know, I'm not a historian of that period, I don't know if there were any Roman cult sites that were there. Most of the Roman city was not on the island, it was actually on the left bank. So that I'm not sure of, if there were pre-Christian sites there. But there were, and even, I'm not going to try to go back through all my slides, but you might have noticed there were some there were some chapels that were built on the north side of Notre Dame that are there in those early 18th century engravings. So there was a church of St. Stephen, so a very important sanctuary dedicated to St. Stephen on the site. And some of them are actually known. There were a number of digs at the west end of the nave. They were hoping to find the foundations of a Merovingian church, which ultimately they did not find. So the major find during the, it was always believed that the medieval rood screen enclosing the altar, which was highly sculpted, had long since disappeared. But as so often, when something is demolished, it's then used as building material on the exact same site. And so when they were digging down, they actually found very substantial pieces of this with their original color intact. Would have been thrilled Viollet-le-Duc no end to have proof that the Middle Ages was highly colored. And they are now on display in the Cluny Museum. So did I answer both parts of your question? Oh, yes, but also, but perhaps I'm telling you things you already know. There has always been a lot of what we might think of as almost secular imagery particularly on the west fronts of cathedrals. The seasons of the year, the labors of the month, but of course, are they really secular? They are also related to the cycle of nature and to the calendar. The zodiac, for instance.
Professor Bergdoll, thank you. That was outstanding. Really great. Have a wonderful week, everyone. And if any of you are interested in going on the Gothic pilgrimage, we hope to lead in 2027. Please let me know. And if you have any particular sites you want to see while we're in France, let me know that as well. That will be a Gothic tour of France. God bless you all. Thank you.